Thanks for joining us for another edition of The Small Business Show with Jim Fitzpatrick, exclusively on ASBN.com.
Organizational structure serves as the blueprint for how tasks are distributed, decisions are made, and communication flows within a company. Joining us to discuss more on this topic is founder and chief visionary of InPrime Legal, Mr. Jonathan Page. You've seen him here before on our network. Jonathan, thanks so much for joining us once again on the show.
Glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Sure. Got a lot of questions and comments last time you were on, so the segment was a big hit with our audience, and so many entrepreneurs and small business owners need good legal advice, as we were just talking about before we got recording today, right?
Yeah.
Yep, for sure. So what legal structures is one of the things I want to talk to you about today. What legal structures are available for organizing a business, and how do they differ? You know, we hear about an LLC and a corporation and a partnership and all of these different things, but as entrepreneurs, and there's many that are about to embark on this, especially as we go into the new year, they need to know more. What's the best route for them to go?
So great question. We get that question all the time. There's really three main structures. You have a limited liability company, corporation, and a partnership.
Okay.
And so when you form an entity, you're typically going to go to the Secretary of State's website of a particular state. They are tasked with forming entities.
Right.
You'll fill out like a form, and it may be like articles of organization for an LLC or articles of incorporation for a corporation.
Right.
And you'll form an entity that way.
Okay.
And so there are big differences. One of the big things to understand is if you're a limited liability company, you are governed by the Limited Liability Act of that state.
Okay.
If you're a corporation, you are governed by the Business Corporation Act of that state.
Okay.
If you're a partnership, you're under the Partnership Code. So there are different statutory schemes that govern that type of entity. And so with a limited liability company, for example, the idea, it's a newer type of entity that came out back in the 70s and 80s. And the idea behind that sort of entity was to give freedom of contract.
Okay.
Essentially, when states started enacting limited liability acts, they said, the owners really should have the freedom and the discretion to create the company in the way that they want to create the company.
Okay.
To have the formalities that they feel comfortable with and that best suit their business needs.
Okay.
And so that's the idea behind a limited liability company. Really didn't get popular, though, until the IRS came out with what's called the box regulations, where they allowed LLCs to make additional tax classifications to say I can be taxed as an S corporation, or I can be taxed, they can be taxed as a partnership if they're multiple members, and that's a pass-through entity that provided a lot of tax benefits, and that's when people really started forming limited liability companies.
Gotcha. Okay. And this is an area that, I highly recommend, by the way. You can go online and you can even go to LegalZoom and what have you. Maybe that's worked for you in the past. I like the old-fashioned way where I can go into an attorney, sit down with them, begin that relationship that is so vitally important for small business owners and entrepreneurs to have, much the way it is with their accountant, because they're going to be calling on them from time to time. And the right entity to set up is so vitally important. This isn't an area that you want to make a mistake in, right?
Absolutely.
Setting it up.
Yeah. So it can have tax implications. Everybody says that you have a silent partner, and that's the IRS.
That's right.
And typically they're a pretty big silent partner.
Yeah,
so,
they are. Yeah.
there's tax implications for how you set it up. There are legal implications for how you set it up. How you might remove a business partner that ends up not being the partner you thought they were.
Sure.
And the process that you go through can be dictated by what entity that you formed.
Right.
So where you form that entity, what state you form it in can have an impact on that. So it's really critical that you think that through and that you have some advice on how to do it based on your situation.
Right. And somebody that is going to kind of hold your hand through the process, but also is there in the event that you do get into any kind of hot water down the road. You can say, hey, let me call, in this case, Jonathan, and say, hey, we set this up, walk me through this. Here's what, here's my issue right now. Can you help me with it? Because it's hard to call one of these online companies and say, hey, I need advice right now on this, right?
Well, there's a big thing that's missed. So if you form a limited liability company, most people don't think about drafting an operating agreement.
Yeah, that's right.
So
that's right.
Based on most state statutes,
Yeah.
an operating agreement technically isn't required,
Yeah.
but it's absolutely critical for your business. If you don't have an operating agreement, the statute itself serves as your operating agreement.
Oh,
and
really?
the rules
Okay.
there are not really favorable.
Right.
And so what you want to do is override those rules and put in the structures that make sense for your business.
Sure.
And any operating agreement at a minimum is going to have a management structure, an ownership structure, and a tax structure.
Okay.
And then depending on how many owners you have, if you've got 2 owners, or if you've got multiple owners, it's going to have a lot of other provisions, like how you exit a business partner, how you resolve disputes.
Right.
All of that needs to be agreed on in advance, and it needs to be written down, and decisions need to be made about that. This is a number one thing that we get is when the partnership isn't working out or the owners aren't working out, they come to us. And the first thing we ask for, if it's a limited liability company, is show us your operating agreement.
Right.
And either they don't have one, or it's just
very weak,
simple operating agreement.
Yeah. They didn't address some of the issues that you just talked about. And even though it might be your brother-in-law, it might be your friend, your best friend, somebody you went to college with, somebody you grew up with, there's going to come a time when there's something comes up in that business that you don't agree with that individual, right? And it can be big enough decision that it breaks up, the partnership, or potentially it could break up the partnership. So that operating agreement is so vitally important, isn't it?
It is, yeah. I mean, just 2 examples that come to mind. We represent a dental office that came to us when they found out one of the dentists had an affair with an office employee.
Oh boy.
A discrimination suit had been filed. They found out that there was embezzlement. His version was that he was just borrowing the money, but he didn't tell any of the partners, right? So
his little secret.
There's always a version that they'll tell, but obviously this ended up being somebody that they realized they shouldn't be in business with. They needed to exit, and they didn't have a very good operating agreement to facilitate that process. So we ultimately were able to exit him, but he got an attorney. There was a lot of legal fees that were involved.
Sure.
So those things they typically don't think through.
That's right.
I had a call on the way here of somebody who got into business with a bad actor. The actor, ultimately didn't run the business well. Now has had a stroke, so it's complicated the situation. There's a big idle loan that they owe $2 million on. And again, they didn't have the right kind of ownership agreements in place that help them deal with that situation successfully.
Right. Yeah. All of these things can be avoided when setting up that foundation, right, of the right entity, and of course the operating agreement. So vitally important. Let me ask you this for people that are listening: husband and wife, do they need an operating agreement if they're in business together?
My wife would say yes.
So would mine.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah, so I think it is.
And we both agree they make all the big decisions, right?
Right. Yeah, that's absolutely right. So there's a concept under law called veil piercing. It's the piercing of the veil. In corporate law, it's been around for a long time, but you can also pierce limited liability shield as well. And essentially the idea behind that is you've got a creditor, the creditor is coming after you, maybe the company isn't in a place to pay that creditor, they go to court. Rather than hiding behind the liability shield, the creditor says to the judge, hey, you should be able to pierce that, and I want to go after their personal assets. I want to go after things that have nothing to do with the business. And the argument that the creditor would make is they really were operating the business as together with themselves. They weren't operating it separate and independent of them personally. They were commingling
They wrote a check to pay their home water bill or something like that, right?
Exactly. So in order to kind of mitigate that, having a written operating agreement in place, and if it's a husband and wife, making sure that in their role as business owners, they are business owners, not husband and wife, becomes really critical.
Yeah, sure does. Yeah, there's no question about it. What factors should be considered when choosing the right legal structure? We just talked about a few of them, but are there any others that jump out at you?
So if you're a business owner and your idea is that you're going to grow organically, you're opening a small business, you're going to grow organically, a limited liability company in most cases is going to be best for you. If you're a company that's going to go out and raise a lot of capital, it may be that you want to organize or incorporate as a corporation. And oftentimes we'll have clients that will organize as a limited liability company initially, and then when they get that first big raise from a more sophisticated investor, they'll require them to convert to a corporation. Because the corporation structure often will favor investors. There's more fiduciary duties there, more requirements there. And then with a corporation, the default rule is that you're going to be taxed as a C corporation, which means double taxation. So it's a very different structure than, say, a pass-through entity. With double taxation, you're going to pay tax at the corporate level on any profits, and then anytime you make a disbursement, you're going to pay tax there as well. But with investors, they're their objective is that you don't make disbursements,
Yeah.
right? And that you continue to reinvest that money
Sure,
in order to grow the
business.
enterprise so
Right.
that when they exit one day,
Yeah.
there may actually be a favorable tax play there for them
Okay.
with it being a C corporation. So there's these different factors that'll play into whether you're a corporation or a limited liability company, but for
Right.
most small business owners who are opening their doors, they intend to grow organically, or maybe they're making their own investment into the company, or they're taking on a small number of investors that they
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
A limited liability company is going to work just fine for them. It's going
Okay.
to give them more freedom,
Okay.
and it's going to be a better structure
Yeah,
overall.
it's the most common one out there, right? Yeah. Would you recommend that they have an entity like that even from day one, even though they don't have any profits, but they've left their full-time job, they're going to go into business for themselves, they might be a consultant, maybe they're going to open up a storefront, maybe they're going to just be something online. They need some protection, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So to form a limited liability company, you're talking about a few $100s.
Right.
Right. You need to get some advice from an attorney, from
That's
a
right.
professional
That's
to
right.
understand what entity to choose. But if it's a limited liability company, it's a few $100s.
Right.
And then you need to put an operating agreement in place. But anytime you're going out into the market and you're market facing, you're inviting liability.
Yeah, you really
right.
are.
You're
Yeah.
inviting people to sue you.
Yep.
Because they feel like your business didn't serve them appropriately or
Right.
caused them some harm.
Sure.
And so being able to protect yourselves,
Yeah.
to protect your personal assets from the liabilities of the
Right.
business becomes really important. And
does.
setting up that entity is a way that you do that.
And that is, again, one of those areas that entrepreneurs often overlook and say, well, I'm just doing it as a side hustle, or I haven't opened up the store yet. I'm still working out of my home. It's not really a company. I don't know that I'm there yet. That's the wrong attitude, right? They need to do that from day one.
Yeah, and then
Right.
they get sued.
Yeah.
They haven't set up that entity.
And it's them that they're getting sued personally.
Anything that
Right.
they own personally
That's
is
right.
now subject to that judgment.
That's right. That's right. And it's such a simple fix.
Yeah.
And you can't go back and do it after you've been, sued to say, oh, I'm going to go open up a company now. Doesn't work that way.
Right, yeah, they were
Yeah.
going to sue who they were dealing with.
That's right.
And at the time that they were dealing with that business owner, they were not, they were just a sole proprietor and didn't
That's
have
right.
an entity in
That's
place.
right. It should also be said that coming up with the operating agreement between the partners can oftentimes come up with a lot of issues that before the partnership moves forward, you may realize, we shouldn't be in partnership together because we don't agree on certain things. We don't agree. If you can't agree on an operating agreement, chances are you're going to have problems down the road.
Yeah,
Right.
I mean, some ones that come up all the time. Obviously, death and disability. What
Right.
happens if that situation occurs with one
Yeah.
of the business owners?
Yeah.
How do you deal with it? But, a question we'll ask is, hey, if your business partner decides that they want to work from the Caribbean
Yeah.
and they're going to move there full time,
Yeah.
are you okay with that?
Right.
Right? Because typically when people get in business together, their expectation is both are going to participate in the business.
That's right.
But your ownership in a company doesn't require participation.
Ah.
It only requires participation if your operating agreement mandates
Says
that.
it. Okay.
Right. And you need to have specific provisions that say if they're not fully participating,
Sure.
and under what circumstances would you designate and say that's not full participation.
That's right.
And then the way to deal with that in the operating agreement is then that creates a buyout right.
Yeah.
The other partners can say, you're not participating, we want to get you out because we
Yeah.
want to free up that equity to get somebody else in who will participate.
Sure.
Or if we're going to do more work, then we want to recapture that equity for ourselves.
That's right. That's right. Also, in the event, as you were saying earlier, if there is a death or disability, that you're not dealing now with that individual's spouse, right? Where somebody comes in and says, okay, I'm taking over their third of the business or their half of the business and let's run this thing. And you go, whoa, wait a minute. I was in business with my buddy. I wasn't in business with his wife or, right?
Yeah,
And
so-
if you don't address that, that could easily be the situation.
Absolutely. So
Yeah.
limited liability companies, one of the big innovations is something called pick your partner. So the idea behind forming a limited liability company is that you should be able to pick your partner.
Yeah.
And so if these certain situations happen, it allows you to get them out and it prevents some third party that you didn't have any intention of being in business with
Right.
stepping in,
Right.
taking control.
Sure.
And so, and you need to implement those strategies through a written operating agreement.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And there can also be, it benefits in the sense that you could open up or take out a life insurance policy on each partner to say, in the event of my passing, then here's the money set aside that you're going to be paid to pay off my spouse, right?
Yeah, so let's say the LLC is the beneficiary of that,
Right.
right? Then questions come up with, what if the valuation of that equity is less than the proceeds? Who keeps the difference?
That's right.
Does it all go to the spouse?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Right?
That's right.
Or does the difference stay with the company?
Right.
And that can go either way.
Sure.
And that's something they need to agree on up front.
Yeah.
I mean, the LLC will be footing the bill for the key man insurance.
Yep.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that the partners want the LLC to be able to keep the remaining funds.
That's right. That's right. Man, we've covered a lot here today. What other things that I know before I let you go? I know you wanted to talk about the beneficial ownership information reporting requirement that's new, right, for businesses. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so there's a new requirement that came out in January 1st, 2024. It's based on a Corporate Transparency Act, which was passed in 2021.
Okay.
The Corporate Transparency Act then tasks the U.S. Department of Treasury, and specifically within the U.S. Department of Treasury, FinCEN, that's the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, to collect.
That's a scary program that you're you're talking about, right? We just got the attention of all of the entrepreneurs listening.
Yeah, I mean, before I go on, if you don't comply with this requirement, it's up to $10,000 in penalties and 2 years in jail.
Wow.
And this is a requirement that's going to affect most business owners.
Okay.
So
listen up, take notes on this one.
Yeah, so essentially FinCEN's collecting a database of beneficial owners of LLCs, corporations, and any entity that you can create on a Secretary of State website.
Okay.
Beneficial owners are anyone who has can exercise substantial control over the entity or controls or owns at least 25% of the ownership interest.
Okay.
And so if you fit that criteria, then you're a beneficial owner.
Okay. So even though let's say I'm an investor in a business, but I own a quarter of it, 25%, I need to be on that.
Yes.
Yeah,
so you'll need to,
it's
going to be your name, your date of birth,
yeah,
your identification number, like from a driver's license or a passport,
Okay.
and then a copy of that driver's license and passport.
Okay.
And all of that's got to be submitted through the FinCEN network.
Really?
And that's the requirement.
Okay.
And you have, if you've formed your LLC in 2024, or your corporation or whatever entity on the Secretary of State's website, you'll have 90 days in order to report that information.
Okay.
If you formed your entity before 2024,
Right.
then you'll have until January 1st, 2025 to comply with the beneficial ownership reporting requirement.
Okay. Okay.
If you form your entity in 2025 or later, then you'll have 30 days to make the report.
Wow.
So
Okay.
the time period gets shortened.
Sure.
But it's really critical that you understand what this requirement is. There's 23 exemptions.
Okay.
One of those exemptions is for a large operating company.
Okay.
A large operating company is any company that can show in the previous tax year through a tax return
Okay.
that they generated more than $5 million in annual gross revenues.
Okay.
And there's always a line there on your tax return, annual revenues.
Sure, not profits, but revenues.
Revenues.
Right.
And that they have at least 20 more than 20 full-time employees.
Okay.
And so if you meet those requirements, you won't have to comply with this.
Okay.
And any subsidiaries wholly owned subsidiaries that you create
Okay.
through a large operating company
Right.
won't have to follow through with this requirement as
Okay.
well.
So
But-
the goal here is that they're really trying to do away with those shell companies where criminals may use it for activity that's just not.
money laundering,
money
tax evasion,
Sure.
those sorts of things.
Okay.
And typically, traditionally, the United States has been a very loose jurisdiction to form a shell company.
Yeah, yeah. So for those entrepreneurs that think, well, I'll just set up a separate LLC over here and then pay that company, so I'm going to try to avoid paying taxes on it, and then that company will do something, and right? I mean, there's all kinds of different shell games taking place out there, and that's what the government's saying. No more. We're gonna track that.
Yeah, they're going to track it. It's a private database. It's not open to the
Okay.
public, but law enforcement will have access to it.
Okay.
And then an interesting sort of wrinkle is that banks will have access to it if they have your consent.
Okay.
But what is expected is that the banks will require your consent to do business.
Okay.
So they will effectively have access to this information
Okay.
as well.
Okay. Gotcha. Any other tips that entrepreneurs should focus on as we move into the new year?
So we've dealt with lots of business ownership, drafting operating agreements, drafting shareholders agreements, and really what we found is there's like 4 things that are absolutely critical. That the owners have the same core values,
Okay.
right? And if you read Vern Harnish or Gino Wickman, they talk about making sure that you understand what your core values are.
Yeah.
Those need to be in alignment. That you have the same mission, which is
Yeah.
all about your products and services. How are you serving your market? How are you benefiting your market? How are you increasing the lives of your customers? That you have the same vision. We see this go wrong all the time. One owner may say, I'm trying to grow this to 100 million. and the other one's fine with a lifestyle business.
That actually happened to me, and I didn't realize it till we were well into business. We were in business about 6 months. Great partner, great friend of mine today, and sat down right after we landed a big account. And I said, "Hey, isn't this great? I mean, can you imagine when we've got a whole office of 50 or 75 employees, and they're hustling, they're on the phone, they're working." And he said, "Well, wait a minute. What do you mean?" He said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "We can go out and get all these clients, and we'll grow this business." He goes, "Oh, no. That's not at all what I had in mind." He goes, "I thought we would keep it small. We maybe a staff of 5 or 10 people tops." And we realized from that point on, this isn't the right partnership. So I ended up buying him out of that company. We still remained very good friends, but it was interesting that it took that conversation instead of sitting down and saying, "Okay, to your point, is everybody rowing in the same direction here?"
Yeah.
Right.
So same core values, same mission, same vision. And the fourth thing that we think is absolutely critical is that they're different in everything else.
Yeah.
So if you see any kind of partnership that was wildly successful, Roy Disney and Walt Disney, completely different.
Really?
Wozniak and Steve Jobs,
Yeah.
completely different, right? If you go back and look at who these people were and these famous partnerships, it was people that were just completely different from each other in every other way.
Yeah. So that's the good news, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Jonathan Page, founder and chief visionary at InPrime Legal. We'll show the information here if you want to get a hold of Jonathan, which if you don't have a good attorney, he's a good attorney, and that's why we like to bring him in here. So, but get somebody on your side that's got this expertise in these areas that we talked about, because it's very, very important. As a good attorney told me one time, a friend of mine, many, many years ago, he said, "Look, Jim, here's the deal. You can either pay me now or you can pay me later. But if you pay me later, it's a lot more money, right? So let's do it right the first time and up front, make sure that you're safe." So, Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us on the show once again. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Thanks for joining us for another edition of The Small Business Show with Jim Fitzpatrick, exclusively on ASBN.com.